Let us start this second video on same as item by looking at the rotation constraining methods for it. What I'm going to do here is take this camera 2 and I'm going to set the other cam as its rotation item here. And what we can see is that by default everything works exactly the same as we have seen so far with the same as item constraint there. We are of course in interpolate mode, we've got world off, we're just getting a direct value copy or a local coordinate copy between the two items. That's fine, that's exactly what we would expect, and to this end none of the rest of the panel works any different, whether we're looking at the interpolate mode, the compensate, the multipliers, the channel switches, blending, all of that is identical to what we have seen in the previous video. The thing to take note of is how things work with pivot rotations. Because of course, unlike position and scale, our rotations aren't just rotations, they are the result of pivot rotations and orientations as well. So what I'll do is just disable MC for a moment there, take this guy that's doing the constraining, the constrain E, turn it at let's say 90 degrees there on its heading and record its pivot rotation. What we see is because we are in value copy mode, we are in local coordinates mode, is we still get the same behavior going on. This guy here gets swung on its pitch, and the one doing the following likewise gets swung on its pitch. Heading follows heading, pitch follows pitch. It is just a straight value copy. And so it respects the pivot rotation to that degree. So that's pretty straightforward and simple. Where things start to get a little bit muddled is when we want to use the world option here. So let's turn that on, and we notice that straight away nothing seems to happen. We're not getting any different behavior, and that indeed is what will happen when the world switch is on. The pivot recording has essentially had little effect because when we recorded this camera pointing at 90 degrees to the other one, we reset its values to 0, 0, 0. So even though we can see that their local spaces are aligned differently here, what we're not getting is a match between those local spaces. We are essentially getting no different a behavior than we had with world off. But of course, don't forget, both of these cameras are currently in the same parent space. So let's noodle things about a bit. Again, I'm just going to have this guy recorded there at 90 on his heading. I'm going to throw in a null and make him a child of that null. If we look again, everything appears fine here. Pitch is still following pitch, heading is still following heading, and so on. Watch what happens when I turn the null. If I turn it on heading, nothing happens. The camera stays completely locked, which of course is what we expect with world mode constraining. But here's the trick. Notice that when I throw the null on, say, its bank here, suddenly the camera starts to drift. Now, why is this happening? The reason is because of the pivot recording and the non-lined up spaces. If we look at where I've turned my null here, we see that it's at 41.6 on bank, and my camera here has gone to negative 41.6 on bank. This starts to demonstrate what the world mode in same as item is sort of doing. It's kind of like a compensate mode in a manner, in so much as it undoes the transforms of the parent space to try and lock the constrainee to the constrainer, but it doesn't see the pivot rotation in that fashion. What we saw before, where it was still following the same channels irrespective of the recorded pivot, wasn't it respecting the pivot rotation, it was the fact that it was blind to the recorded pivot rotation. And that is the problem that we are seeing here. The reason that we don't get any kind of drift when I turn the null on its heading here is because of course the pivot rotation recording was only done on heading for this item, and so the two are able to counteract one another properly. They are able to counteract one another in line because they are still lined up with one another. But owing to the rotation order of things, the other axes are not lined up to one another, such that when one of those gets twisted, even though the camera gets the correct values for its own orientation, it is getting the incorrect values for its pivot rotation. Thus, it doesn't lock to this fella the way that it should, or that we would want it to. This goes the other way as well. So if, for instance, I take the camera that is being followed and I rotate it to 90 degrees and pivot record it there, and I add a null here which I make its parent there, then again with this camera down here following it in world, we can see that if we take the null and rotate it on heading, this follower camera still comes along for the ride as we would expect it to, inheriting the world rotation of the item that it is following. But again, when we start turning off in other directions, such as this, we see that we're getting a tip in the wrong direction. However, because it is the item being followed that has now been pivot recorded, we see that it does behave as before here. So as this camera goes side to side, the following camera also goes side to side. We don't get a drift off, as it were. We're getting the same behavior that we had when they were effectively both within the same space. So there is a slight difference depending on which item has been pivot recorded and the space that it's under. But what is still true in both cases is that the constraint is blind to that pivot recording. What about having the pivot recording the other way round though? Let's say that we add the null and we take the null and we turn it. Let's say I'm going to turn it to 90 on its bank and pivot record it thus. Then I'll parent my cam2 under it and again have it following the cam1 in world. What we see in this instance is that the whole thing works out in this fashion, and when rotating the null, that is the parent of that camera, the camera does still stay locked. It counter rotates to match this rotation properly. Again, we'll take the alternative proposition of having another null here, which is rotated and pivot recorded somehow or other, and which becomes the parent of the item being followed. Once again, the same as item constraint is able to see through this, and irrespective of the rotations placed on there, we're not getting a miss drift. This basically lays down a simple rule for getting this thing to work predictably. And the simple rule is this: the rotations and pivot recordings, orientations of hierarchy items that either your follower or followee are children of make no difference. But what is important is that you have the two items which are constrained to one another. Their orientations need to be matched in the sense of the world space in order to get a correct locked rotation constraint behavior. By way of example, let's imagine something like the following. Here I have just a simple little IK system that's been set up for something, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that I've set this up for an arm. In this case, I have pivot recorded and rotated or reoriented the different bones here. So in this case, heading for this first bone is up down and pitches side to side. For the second bone, that's at 90 degrees, so of course the heading is the turn angle here. And then for the hand, I would imagine the flap up down here, we'll assume this was palms down, say, to be my major axis, and so that is pivot recorded again. So I have 90 degree pivot recording, negative 90 pivot recording, 90 pivot recording again. Now, one thing that we notice about this IK system is that the end item, the hand, if you will, is just operating freely on keyframes on FK here. And one thing that's very common, of course, with IK is that you want to lock the rotation of this item to the goal. We see various ways of doing that in the IK videos, but one method that can be done is to use the same as item controller. So we can take this guy, set its rotation item to be the goal, and we can set everything here to same as item. Obviously that's not quite right, because of course it's just doing the straight value copy, which isn't what we want. What we want is for it to be done under world. But you notice that as soon as we turn that on, it goes a bit peculiar, of course, because of the pivot rotation, and you see that as this thing moves around, its rotation is hardly what we would say to be locked to the goal item. It's a bit all over the place, of course, because we're getting these crossed over axes. The way to fix this is very simple. We can see in this instance that the goal item is just in the standard world orientation. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that we'd done something weird where we wanted it pivot recorded somewhat like that. We can see, of course, that this is an even worse behavior on the locking to the hand item there. The way that we would fix this is simple. We would find the root of our bones. In this case, it's just this null here, but it might well be your character item or some other root null. This is currently in the normal world orientation. We would add a child to it. I'm just going to name this SAI so as it stands out. And what we see, of course, is that this by default has the base world orientation. It's in the same space as the goal was. Now the goal has been rotated at 90 degrees and pivot recorded, so I'm going to rotate this exactly the same at 90 degrees and pivot record it. Let me just give it a little colour change there to make it stand out. What I shall then do is take it down here to the point of the wrist, I suppose we would call it, make it a child of that forearm bone here, and then take my hand and make it an immediate child of that same as item bone. Notice I want to take off the constraint that I had set up there. We see, of course, that once I reparent this under there, it's wound up with a different rotation value, but that's okay. It's still in the same order as we want it, though we can pivot record it, and of course it stays where it is. The important thing is to not now pivot record this guy, because his orientation, his world relative orientation, is the same as that for the goal. So I can now take this SAI bone, give it the goal as the rotation item, everything over to same as item, turn on world mode, and what we see is that now the system is properly locked and the whole thing functions exactly as we would expect it to. So if you're stuck for getting two things to match by using the same as item rotation constraint, just create them in the same space, both with the same pivot recording, then parent them in where they need to go, turn on world, and they will match. The last thing to be aware of with the rotation item constraint is the issue of Euler domains, which we mentioned back in Foundations, and which of course is also seen in the targeting behavior. What we see in the local axis mode is of course a straight value copy, so if this thing comes round here to, I know, however many, 320, 600 odd degrees, then of course this item here is also at 600 odd degrees. But when in world mode, that does not happen, and we get things matched by vectors, which of course converts down to Euler, respecting the Euler domain limitations. So if we turn on the world for it, and we turn this again to whatever, 600 odd degrees, then we can see of course that we are 600 degrees for this fella, but we go and look at the one that is constraining to it, and he's at 180, negative 80, 180. His rotation values are held within the Euler domain. The place where this comes out most noticeably, of course, is if you only have the same as item on a single channel, and of course not the first channel heading, but one of the subsequent ones. So here I am only on pitch with world mode enabled. And what we notice, even in the case here where they're both in the same space, there's no parenting or pivot rotation or anything else, is that as the item being followed hits 90 degrees, the other thing starts to turn backwards, because just like targeting, this behavior would expect the heading to be pulled round in the opposite direction. We see if I turn the bank on as well, so we've got pitch and bank on same as item, then as it turns past 90 degrees, boom, we get a little flip on the bank there. So just like targeting, you have to be careful when you're trying to make a world constraint operate under only a single axis. You should always prefer heading. Or of course, if you only want it on two axes, choose heading first, then pitch, then bank, depending on how many axes you want to be constrained to the world rotations of the other item. So with all of those operational methods described and understood, what we can see with SAI is that it really gives us two different types of function that we'll call on commonly. One such function is the mechanic-like function, if you will, turn cog A and cog B responds appropriately. But due to its blending capabilities, it also gives us something not too dissimilar to a dynamic parent. In the same way that a child item follows its parent item and inherits its space, you can do very similar things with same as item. And in fact, in many other packages, that which we call same as item here in Lightwave is known as a parent constraint. As such, so long as we follow the rules properly, it's very easy to do such things. So if we see here, we have our two different characters with their different setups, and we can see that we've got this guy with his arm here operating on IK. What we can very simply and easily do is sort of pose it somehow as though he were grabbing this fellow's arm here, perhaps in something of this fashion. That's more or less close enough, I guess. We can simply clone this item off. Of course, now we have a clone of the item with the same coordinates, the same space and orientation. In this case, just to make it more identifiable, I'll give it a different little shape there. We can then reparent it off somewhere, say to this fellow's elbow, so simply just parent it over like that, making sure, of course, not to re-record the pivot, just leaving it at this base rotation that it gets within that new space. We can then jump back to the original item, give that both a rotational same as item constraint to the new pin item we've created, of course in world mode, and also clearly the same for its position channels, once again in world mode. And what we then have, of course, is the item from this character parented, as it were, to this character's body part, and thus the two will interact appropriately, like this. If you're really clever, then of course when you have this IK goal set up for this first character, you will set up an offset item for it, so even though I can't move this main IK goal whilst it's constrained, I can move its immediate offset child, so I can still move this, point of grabbing around within the new parent space, or the constrained parent space, as it were. And you get all of this stuff working out just great. The other thing about same as item to take note of, which is again demonstrated very well here, is of course the fact that it's only a single constraint. That is to say, I can't have multiples on the same item. It's all well and good that I've been able to constrain it over to this fellow's arm here, but what if in the same animation, in the same scene, I wanted to then constrain it back to something else? So he grabs this guy's arm for a bit and then he grabs, say, his own head. I can't have multiple position items, but what you can do with the same as item control is to chain them. So I take hold of this cloned item, which I put the constraint to initially, and I make a clone of it. I can then take that first pin item, constrain it to the second one, and then of course I can have this second one go somewhere else entirely, say up by our fellow's head here, posing it up in some appropriate manner like this, and then of course just parenting it back over to his head. And hey presto, look, there we go. He's now cross-constrained that way. Of course this will also interoperate with other constraints, so here the head and neck system I also have this world system set up for, or the head float system as I call it, which keeps the head in a constant space, and we can see that it all of course works with that. The whole thing is able to interconnect and interoperate, and the constraints always find one another, just so long as you've got the coordinates matched correctly. Otherwise, you can go on chaining for as many items as you like or need to. It's very easy to set up. The only thing you have to remember to do is to not record pivot rotations when you reparent from one space into another for an item to constrain toward. So there we are, the same as item constraint all over. We'll see an awful lot of it being used when we are building our rigs.